Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Andy and you're watching the Opinionated Reefer YouTube channel. So, you've got dinoflagellates and you're having no luck beating them. You've tried raising your nutrients, you've tried dosing pods, you've tried dosing phyto, nothing's working. Well, this is a video for you. I'll show you how to beat dinoflagellates without doing any of that bullshit. So you found yourself with dinoflagellates, and if you're anything like me, you probably did a bit of research and it led you to this group, Max Dinos support group. So what these guys will tell you to do is get yourself a microscope and try to identify exactly what type of dinos you've got. Now, once you've identified the type of dinos you've got, they will then suggest various treatments dependent on the strain of dinos. So, for example, they may tell you to dose nitrates, dose pods, generally raise your nutrients, dose water glass to try and induce a diatom bloom to outcompete the dinos, dose various different types of pods to try and eat the dinos, and just generally increase biodiversity in the tank. Now, I'm not saying that is necessarily a bad thing. I'm a big believer in adding as much biodiversity to the tank as possible. But these are long-term strategies. They're not going to help you defeat a massive outbreak of dinos in any sort of reasonable time span. So what seems to happen is people will try and follow this advice, and then in a lot of cases they end up spending months trying the various different strategies to no avail, basically just chasing their tail and wasting their time, and they end up throwing in the towel and giving up the hobby or completely restarting the tank only to then face dinos again where they just quit at that point. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not bad mouthing the guys over at Max Dinos support group. I'm sure they've got the best of intentions, but to be quite honest with you, I think most of the advice is based on hearsay and pseudoscientific bullshit, if I'm perfectly honest. Before I go over how I actually beat the dinoflagellates, I'd just like to cover why dinoflagellates have become such a big problem in the hobby these days. You'll often hear old school reefers claim that they had never faced dinoflagellates in the hobby before, and this is only a recent phenomenon. Now, I think the reason for that is back in the day, nearly all tanks were started with 100% live rock from the ocean, and the lighting they used back in those days weren't as powerful as they are now. So when you start a tank with cured live rock that came from the ocean, it's an insta tank. There is no such thing as a cycle or an ugly stage or any of that to go through. You're basically supplying all the biodiversity and maturity that the tank needs in one go. But in complete contrast to that, when you start a tank with dry rock, there is no biodiversity, there's no bacteria. To top it off, we're all using super powerful LED lighting. It's basically the perfect breeding ground for dinoflagellates. So basically what happens is the lack of biodiversity combined with the strong lighting just makes the dinos get out of control. Now, the one big myth that seems to perpetuate this hobby is that dinoflagellates is caused by low nutrients. Now, I don't believe it's got anything to do with low nutrients. I've had dinos take hold with super high nutrients in the past, and this current tank certainly didn't have low nutrients. It's lack of biodiversity and competing organisms, basically. Another thing you'll often hear is that dinos is in every tank and it's just waiting to raise its ugly head. Now, I don't believe that is necessarily the case. Now, sure, there's probably some form of dinoflagellate in every tank, but that doesn't mean every tank has every pest species of dinos. These pest species of dinos have got into that tank because you put them there. It's as simple as that. Now, my personal theory is that These pest species of dinos that everybody keeps getting have adapted to our tank conditions. And what's happening is they're getting passed from hobbyist to hobbyist and local fish shop to local fish shop on frags. And this has basically came about due to people's lack of quarantining and dipping corals. And now what we've ended up with is the equivalent of a superbug plaguing the hobby that's adapted to live and thrive in our current low biodiversity tanks. And because these strains are now so prevalent in the hobby and people don't use live rock to start their tanks, it basically means that Dinoflagellates is unavoidable for 99% of new hobbyists. So with that in mind, I'll just go through what actually happened to my tank and my own experience with Dinoflagellates and how I actually beat them in the end. So this was my tank about 6 months ago. I had just moved over a bunch of corals from the nano tank to this Reefer 350, and what I did was I ended up bringing this Dinoflagellates that you can see here with the corals. They had been in the nano tank, but because the nano tank was a bit more mature, they weren't causing a problem. As soon as I moved the frags over to the Reefer 350 and it was a new setup, boom, the Dinoflagellates just took hold, as well as some cyano. So what I ended up doing was dosing Dino X, which does work, but it's very harsh on the corals. So I ended up overdosing it and actually losing a lot of these corals, which I covered in a previous video. So now what you're looking at is the state of the tank after I had lost a lot of corals due to the Dino X. I had moved most of the corals back into the nano tank basically to save them. As you can see, a lot of the dinos has actually gone, but then that was replaced with hair algae, which is what usually happens if you beat one thing in a reef tank, another pest will raise its head and actually take over. So I ended up leaving the tank like this for 2 or 3 months. It took quite a while for the tank to actually recover from the overdose of Dino X. I'm not sure what exactly happened, but the biological balance of the tank was disturbed, and although the fish were fine, it just couldn't seem to sustain corals. So what you're looking at here is some reasonable quality live rock that I managed to get a hold of. Once I added that to the tank, it actually worked wonders, and within a few weeks I was able to add corals again and they would stay alive. Another sign that the live rock added was actually good quality is within days my nitrates started to drop, indicating that it had added a bunch of beneficial bacteria. So at this point I decided to add a few tester corals back to the tank, as you can see here. And within days, lo and behold, the dinoflagellates were back. As you can imagine, I was starting to get a bit pissed off by this point. So this is when I decided to give some of the methods suggested in the dinoflagellate support group and various forums a try. I figured I had nothing left to lose at this point, so I went and bought myself a kid's microscope and managed to identify 2 different strains of dinos that were present in the tank. So the first thing I did was take a sample of the brown snotty stuff from the rockwork that had bubbles in it. This is what we're looking at here, and it was identified as Osteropsis, however you may pronounce that, I don't know. But you could tell it was that type of dinos because of the sharp points at the front of the cells. I then took a sample of the brown stuff from the sandbed, and this is what we're looking at here, and I believe that's pronounced Amphidinium dinos. Now apparently this type of dinos only stays in the sandbed and doesn't actually go up into the water column, which I'm not 100% convinced of, but that's the claim anyway. So I went back to the Dinoflagellates support group with these videos and was given a prognosis of what I just said, Osteropsis and Amphidinium, and I was told that Osteropsis should be relatively easy to eliminate, but the Amphidinium is really hard to eliminate, basically because it never goes into the water column. Now, I was told that the only way to beat this would be to raise nutrients and start dosing pods and increasing biodiversity, raise your nitrates, etc., etc. So I went and bought some NIOS nitrate and we started dosing that and raised my nitrates up as I was told, as well as dosing pods, and this is the result. It was like throwing petrol on a bonfire. The dinoflagellates exploded all over the tank. And to be quite honest with you, I was ready to throw in the towel. So, just like I expected, raising the nutrients, dosing pods did absolutely nothing. Just made the situation worse. So, what I decided to do at that point was try a UV steriliser. Now, initially, I bought a 24-watt green killing machine because it is the only in-tank UV steriliser that I could find, and I'd heard other people saying it had worked for them. So, I installed the green killing machine, but after a couple of weeks, it had made absolutely zero difference. So, I decided one last roll of the dice, and I went and bought an expensive DD 20-watt UV steriliser and a pump to go with it. And within 3 days, the dinoflagellates were 90% gone. The key to success when fighting dinos with a UV steriliser is to have a slow flow through the unit and to mount it in a display to display loop like I've done here. Another point I'd like to make is don't bother with a cheap or low powered UV steriliser. You want as powerful a unit as you can possibly fit on your tank. So this is the current state of the tank. I've been running the UV steriliser for just over a month now, and I've moved over all the corals and fish from the nano tank, and everything is doing well. Now you can still see some brown stuff on the sand bed, but I don't think that is actually Dinos this time. And even if it is, I don't really care because it's not causing any problems. And as you can see here, the rockwork is starting to get covered in a lovely pink coralline algae rather than a brown slime. So the moral of the story is the single most effective thing you can do to fight dinoflagellates in a reef tank is just to install a high-powered UV steriliser. It's that simple. It's not going to affect your tank negatively, and you hear people saying things like, oh, if I install a UV steriliser, my tank won't mature. Bullshit. It'll mature perfectly fine. And to top it off, you'll be protected from dinoflagellates and potentially some waterborne parasites. It's a win-win if you ask me. Another thing that I noticed was that a lot of the top reefing YouTubers such as Coral Euphoria, Reef Bum, even BRS TV recommend you use a UV steriliser for dinoflagellates. So the plan going forward is I'll run the UV steriliser for another couple of months, then I'll probably remove it just because it's in such an awkward position. Other than that, the tank's doing great. You might have noticed that I've got quite a few frags in the tank, and I think I've actually mounted them a bit too close together. I'm going to have to separate some of the SPS frags out just to give them growing room. I've also upgraded the T5 unit from a 6-tube ATI Sun Power to an 8-tube ATI Sun Power dimmable, and I added 8 brand new ATI tubes. So you might be thinking this is a bit overkill for a Red Sea Reefer 350, and you're probably right. But since this is going to be an SPS dominated tank, I wanted light coverage from end to end and back to front, and this achieves that. Well, that's it, guys. Hopefully you found this interesting and you now realise that beating dinoflagellates needn't be a chore. So I'll catch you on the next one. Adios.